Roads out to the property got quieter the further I drove from town. That was the whole point. I bought the farm in the spring of 2019, about 8 months after I retired from 34 years as a civil engineer with the county. 58 years old, healthy enough, with a pension that covered my basics and a savings account I'd been feeding for 3 decades. My wife Carol had passed 4 years earlier from ovarian cancer. After she was gone, I stayed in our house in Columbus for a while, but the neighborhood had changed, and honestly, so had I. I needed something to do with my hands, something to take care of. The property was 83 acres in eastern Ohio, just outside a small town called Caldwell. Rolling hills, a creek that ran along the back fence line, a hay barn that needed a new roof, and a farmhouse built in 1947 that had good bones but 20 years of neglect. The seller was an older woman named Helen, who had inherited it from her brother and couldn't manage it herself. I paid $340,000, cash. I had saved it. Every dollar. I spent the first year fixing things. I replaced the roof on the barn. I rewired the farmhouse. I put in a new well pump, resurfaced the kitchen floors, repainted every room. I planted a kitchen garden and learned, badly at first, how to grow tomatoes and green beans and sweet corn. My daughter Renee used to call me on Sunday evenings and laugh at my farming updates. She thought it was charming. She thought I was finally relaxing. Renee was 31 at the time. She had married a man named Troy Galloway 3 years earlier, and I will say now what I was too careful to say then. I never liked him. Not because of anything dramatic, at least not at first. He was just the kind of man who talked a lot without saying much. He had a sales job that he described differently every time I asked about it, and he had a habit of picking up the check at restaurants and then mentioning it 4 or 5 times over the next hour. Renee loved him. I kept my mouth shut. They lived in an apartment in Akron, about an hour and a half from the farm. Renee taught elementary school. Troy sold something related to commercial insurance, though I never fully understood the specifics, and I am not sure he did either. His parents, Frank and Norma Galloway, lived in a double-wide outside Zanesville. Frank had worked in manufacturing until his plant closed, and Norma had never worked outside the home. They were not bad people when I first met them. A little rough around the edges, a little loud, but harmless, I thought. The first conversation that made me uneasy happened on a Thursday evening in October of 2021. Troy called me, which was unusual. He never called me directly. He usually let Renee do the communicating between our households, which I had always assumed was because he found me boring or intimidating or both. He opened with small talk. How was the farm? How was the garden? Had I gotten the furnace checked before winter? I answered politely. Then he said, "Actually, I wanted to run something by you, Howard." I told him to go ahead. He said his parents were in a difficult spot. Frank's health had been declining and they were behind on the lot rent for the double wide, and Norma was not sleeping well because of the stress of it all. He told me this slowly, building towards something, and I waited. Then he said, "We were thinking it might make sense for them to come stay out at the farm for a while, just while they get back on their feet. There's plenty of room, and you're out there alone anyway." I did not say anything for a moment. I wanted to make sure I understood what he was proposing before I responded. "Troy," I said, "are you asking me to let your parents move into my home?" "Just temporarily," he said. "A few months maybe. It would be a real help to them." I told him I appreciated that his parents were having a hard time, but that was not something I was willing to do. The farm was my home. I had worked for 34 years to have it, and I was not in the business of taking in boarders, including family members I barely knew. He said he understood. The call ended politely enough. I thought that was the end of it. It was not. Renee called 2 days later. Her voice had that careful tone she used when she was delivering news she knew I would not like. She said Troy had mentioned the conversation to her, and she just wanted to say that she understood my position, but Frank was really struggling, and maybe I could think about it a little more. I told her gently that I had already thought about it, and my answer had not changed. She said okay. She did not push. Then, in December, I drove up to Akron for a weekend visit. We had dinner at their apartment, and about halfway through the meal, Troy said, very casually, as if we were simply continuing a previous conversation, "I think once Mom and Dad get settled in, they really love the east bedroom. Great light in the mornings." I set down my fork. "Settled in where?" I said. He looked at me with this expression of mild confusion, like I was the one who had said something strange. "At the farm," he said. "We figured it was all worked out." I looked at Renee. She was looking at her plate. Nothing has worked out, I said. I told you no in October. That answer hasn't changed. Troy leaned back in his chair. The easy manner dropped off of him like a coat. He said, Howard, these are my parents. They need help. You have an entire farmhouse sitting mostly empty. I don't really see what the problem is. The problem, I said, is that it's my home. And I said no. He said something else after that. Something about how family helps each other, and how I had more than enough space, and how he had hoped I would be more generous than this. I listened until he was finished. Then I said goodnight. I thanked Renee for dinner, and I drove back to the farm. On the drive home, I called my attorney. Not that night. It was too late. But first thing the next morning. His name is David Shen, and I had worked with him on the property purchase. I explained the situation and asked what my options were if someone showed up at the property uninvited. He told me that an unauthorized entry would constitute criminal trespass under Ohio law, and if I had evidence of it, I could pursue charges. He told me to document everything. I took that advice seriously. I ordered 6 security cameras, 2 for the exterior of the farmhouse, covering the front porch, the back door, and the driveway, 2 more for the barn and the access road, 1 for the inside of the mudroom, 1 for the front hallway, covering the staircase and the main living area. I also installed a video doorbell and a keypad lock on every exterior door. The system backed up to a cloud server and sent alerts to my phone. I also changed the combination on the lockbox that held the spare key. Only David had the new code in case of emergency. I did not tell Troy or Renee that I had done any of this. January passed quietly. February, the same. I began to think maybe I had overreacted. Maybe Troy had accepted the answer and moved on. In the second week of March, on a Wednesday morning, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the driveway camera. I was in the barn replacing a hinge on the lower door. I pulled out my phone and looked at the screen. There was a pickup truck I did not recognize parked at the end of my driveway. 2 people were getting out of it. An older man moving slowly, leaning on the truck bed as he steadied himself, and an older woman carrying a plastic tote bag. I watched them walk toward my front porch. I watched the woman try the door handle. I watched them look at each other when it didn't open. I watched the man try the handle himself. Then I watched Troy's car pull in behind the truck. Troy got out and walked to the front door. He had something in his hand. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. He was holding a key. I stood in the barn for about 30 seconds watching the footage. Then I called 911. I told the dispatcher my name. I gave the address, and I said there were 3 people attempting to enter my home without my permission, and that the person at the door appeared to have a key he had obtained without my authorization. The dispatcher asked if I wanted to stay on the line. I said yes. I walked toward the house. I came around from the side so they did not see me until I was about 20 feet away. Troy was still working the key in the lock, frowning, because the keypad had disabled the old lock's mechanical function. Frank and Norma were standing on the porch steps behind him. Troy, I said. He turned around. He had the decency to look startled. Howard, he said. Hey, where did you get that key? I said. He said Renee had given it to him a long time ago, back when they first started dating, in case of an emergency. This was news to me. It was also, I realized, the answer to a question I hadn't known to ask. I turned to Frank and Norma. Mr. and Mrs. Galloway, I said. I don't know what Troy has told you, but you do not have my permission to be on this property. I have called the sheriff's department. Norma put her hand over her mouth. Frank looked at Troy. Troy said, Howard, come on. Can we just go inside and talk about this? There is nothing to talk about, I said. I told you no in October. I told you no in October. I told you no again in December. You drove your parents 4 hours to my property without my consent. He started to say something about family again, about how I was being rigid and unreasonable, about how his father could barely walk. I let him talk. I kept the phone in my hand. The deputy arrived 11 minutes later. His name was Deputy Harlan, a younger guy, maybe 30, calm and thorough. He talked to each of us separately. I showed him the camera footage on my phone. The footage of the truck pulling in, of Troy using the key, of all 3 of them attempting to enter without permission. Deputy Harlan spoke to Troy at length. He explained that this constituted criminal trespass under Ohio Revised Code 291121, and that the property owner, meaning me, had the right to pursue charges. He advised Troy to remove himself, his parents, and their belongings from the property immediately. Troy looked at me like he expected me to intervene on his behalf. I did not. Frank and Norma loaded back into the truck without making eye contact with me. Norma was crying, and I felt bad for her. I want to be honest about that. She was not the one who had organized this, but she was also here, standing on my porch, so, after they left, I called Renee. She answered on the second ring. She knew something had happened because I never called in the middle of the day. I told her, as calmly as I could, that her husband had just driven his parents to my property with a key she had given him years ago, without telling me, and that I had needed to call the sheriff to have them removed. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He told me you had agreed." I said, "I told him no twice. Explicitly. In October and in December." Another silence. She said, "Dad, I need to call you back." I said okay. While I waited, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and I looked around the room, the repainted walls, the refinished floors, the view out the window of the hay barn with its new roof, and beyond it, the creek, and beyond that, the hill I had walked every single morning for 2 years. I had spent 34 years working so that I would have a place like this. Renee called back 2 hours later. She had spoken to Troy. He had admitted, when pushed, that he had not told her about either of my refusals. He had told her I was thinking it over. He had let her believe the arrangement was being worked out, and when she had mentioned the East bedroom comment at dinner back in December, she had assumed I was coming around rather than confronting a plan I was hearing for the first time. But there was something else. When Renee pushed him about their finances, about why this was so urgent, about what was really going on with Frank and Norma's situation, things came apart. Troy had been sending money to his parents for over a year, not small amounts. He had transferred a combined total of around $36,000 from their joint account over the previous 18 months. Renee had not known because Troy managed their finances. He had told her they were saving for a down payment on a house. The savings were gone. She found out by asking to see the bank statements. He hedged at first, then stalled, and that hesitation told her everything. She went to the branch that afternoon and requested a full statement history. The transfers were all there, steady and regular, sometimes 2 or 3 a month, always to the same account. His parents' account. I did not know any of this when she called me that second time. She told me in pieces, her voice getting quieter as she went. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "Renee, I need you to talk to an attorney." She said she already had a name from a coworker, a family law attorney in Akron. I will not go through all of the details of what followed because some of it belongs to Renee and not to me. What I can tell you is that the financial records were subpoenaed as part of the divorce proceedings, and they told a complete story. Troy had been supporting his parents financially for years before the money in their joint account ran out. When their savings were depleted, he had devised the farm plan, presumably calculating that if his parents were living rent-free on my property, the financial pressure on him would ease. What he had not calculated was that I would say no, and then say no again, and that when he showed up anyway, I would have 6 cameras running and a sheriff's deputy's number already dialed. The criminal trespass case was a misdemeanor. Troy received a citation and a fine. His parents were not charged. His attorney worked out an agreement where the charges against Troy were reduced in exchange for a written acknowledgement that he had no claim to or interest in my property, which I had my attorney file with the county recorder's office. The divorce was finalized the following February. Renee got the joint account balance, what little was left, and Troy was ordered to repay the $36,000 over a structured timeline. She moved into a smaller apartment in Columbus, closer to me, and she has been doing well. She started going to a financial literacy workshop through her school district, which she jokes about, but which I think has genuinely helped her feel less like the ground could be pulled out from under her without warning. The farm is still mine. I walk to the creek most mornings. The hay barn still has its new roof. The tomatoes came in well last summer, and I finally figured out how to keep the deer out of the green beans. There are things I think about when I walk out there. I think about the fact that I had no idea Renee had given out a key and that I should have had that conversation earlier. I think about how long Troy had been building toward that Wednesday in March and how confident he must have been that I would simply let it happen. I also think about the cameras, 6 of them positioned at every angle, running on a system that backed up to the cloud every 10 minutes. That footage, those 12 minutes of footage from a Wednesday morning in March, was the clearest and most important document in every proceeding that followed, more than the phone calls, more than my attorney's letters, more than anything I could have said in any room. I had not argued. I had not raised my voice. I had simply been prepared. Renee asked me once, after the divorce was through, why I had installed the cameras before anything had actually happened. I told her that Troy had a way of making things sound reasonable in the moment, and I had not wanted to be in a position where it was my word against his. She said, "You knew." I said I had suspected. I said there was a difference. She nodded. Then she said, "I'm sorry I gave him the key." I told her she didn't know what he would do with it. That was true. She had given it to a man she loved and trusted, which is a thing people do when they love and trust someone. I told her it was not her fault. I meant it. The farm is quiet in the evenings. The light comes in low across the hill around 6 o'clock and turns everything a kind of gold that I still haven't gotten used to after 6 years. Carol would have loved it out here. She always wanted more space, more sky. I have both now, and I intend to keep them. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that Wednesday morning in March. Not in any grand philosophical way. Just the plain, practical kind. The kind where you trace a line backward from how things ended and ask yourself, what made this possible? Troy did not walk onto my property because he was a bold man. He walked onto it because he had spent years learning that things tended to work out for him when he pushed hard enough. He had pushed Renee into managing the finances alone, and that had worked. He had moved money out of their joint account for 18 months without her noticing, and that had worked too. When those resources ran out, he looked around for the next solution and he saw my farm. He saw a quiet older man living alone, and he calculated that eventually I would simply give in. What he did not account for was that I had spent 34 years as an engineer. My entire career was about understanding systems, about knowing where the weak points were before something failed. I had looked at this situation and I had thought through every possible way it could go wrong, and then I had addressed each one methodically. Changed the locks, installed the cameras, called my attorney, documented the conversations. I was not smarter than Troy in any general sense. I just refused to be caught unprepared. That is what I mean when I think about intelligence in this context. Not cleverness. Not the ability to argue well in the moment. The intelligence that actually protects you is slower and quieter than that. It is the discipline to think ahead when you would rather just hope the problem goes away. The integrity piece is harder to talk about, because I felt the pull of the easy path more than I have admitted to most people. When Troy first proposed the arrangement, part of me thought about how much simpler it would be to just say yes for a few months, and then find a way to end it gracefully. I knew how these things actually went. A few months becomes a year. A year becomes permanent. But the temptation to avoid the conflict was real. It would have cost me less in the short term. What stopped me was not cleverness. It was a clear sense of what was mine and what I owed to the version of myself that had spent 34 years earning it. I was not willing to hand over something I had built out of discomfort about saying no. That is the only honest way I can describe it. And Renee. I think about her a lot in this context. She gave Troy a key years ago because she loved him and trusted him. That is not a character flaw. That is a reasonable thing to do with someone you have committed your life to. What she learned from all of this was not that trust is foolish. It was that trust without verification creates a gap that a certain kind of person will eventually walk through. She is more careful now. Not colder, just more clear-eyed. I am proud of her for that. The farm is still here. The cameras are still running. I walk the property every morning and I think about what it took to keep it, and I do not take a single acre of it for granted.